Czech GM David Navara takes his chair. He is going to play against Gukesh at the 5th round of the Prague Masters. This promises to be a very, very exciting clash. David is the top Czech GM for years now. Gukesh enters there with a cup. And look at that namaste by David. He likes to greet his opponents in their own language. And such a respectful gentleman he is in the world of chess. Maybe one of the most humble people out there, David Navara. And Gukesh playing now with the white pieces. He's had a good tournament. He is on +1 right now. He has 1 win and 3 draws, and he'll be looking to score his 2nd win here. An important game for him because he has the white pieces. Against David, he has not won until now. He has had 2 games before, 1 loss, and their last encounter ended in a draw. Gukesh now has close to 80 elo more than David, so he's clearly the rating favorite, but you can never underestimate David Navara. Both the players are known for their calculating ability. And by the way, there we have the game starting. Once again, David gets up from his chair to greet his opponent, wish him the best of luck, and Gukesh opens with 1 c4. The English opening is on the board, and David goes knight to f6. The English is a very flexible opening because you can transpose it to many other openings in due course. We'll see what Gukesh does here. He puts his knight out to c3. It's logical chess. And now David, will he play e5? Yes, he does. So we are in reverse Sicilian, the main line of the English here. And Gukesh now plays his pawn up to e3. He wants to maybe play d4 at the right time, and David will most likely play his knight to c6. Yes, that's the typical move. And now white can play knight to f3, which is the normal move, but he goes queen b3. Very interesting choice. The idea is to stop d5, but it's a slightly artificial way to do it. Magnus had done it once before against Anish Giri. And queen b3, b6 played by David. In fact, this move has never been played before, and David plays it so quickly, which means that he is well prepared. The game Anish Magnus had continued with g6 there, not with b6, but now bishop comes out to b7 and Gukesh plays the move a3. It was also possible to strike in the center with d4, but Gukesh maybe is looking for an original game with no theory, so he plays his pawn up to a3. And now what does David do? Does he take the challenge and push the pawn forward? That would really sharpen up the game. Why? Because then the knight would attack the pawn, and then he plays it, and the other knight will jump and attack the pawn from g5. Gukesh, not shying away from the fight, plays knight g5. Knight e5 is a great move because you use your bishop to defend this and also attack the d3 square. But David goes queen e7. Now you can actually attack the pawn one more time with queen c2. Then you have 3 attackers on the e4 pawn. He plays his queen back to c2, and now the e4 pawn is under pressure. Whoa, David Navara, long castles here. So you are now defending this twice, you are attacking this thrice, and Gukesh says thank you so much for the pawn. But remember the bishop sitting here on b7. It will unleash itself. How? Well, David shows the way. He plays his knight to d4. If you take the knight, this is going to be danger because now the file opens up, the bishop opens up. So Gukesh has to remain careful. He finds a great move. He plays queen d3. And with this move, he puts pressure on the knight. Bishop takes e4 played. There was also another move like knight b3. But then after take and rook b1, the position looks fine. So he goes bishop e4, knight e4. And now queen takes on e4 has occurred on the board. And for Gukesh now, he can trade the queens in two ways. He can take here or he can take on d4. With his calculations, he feels he should take on e4 first, the queen. And David comes in with a cup of tea and a spoon and sits down because he knows that he will have to calculate quite a bit there. Knight takes e4 taken, and now Gukesh can chop off the knight. So Gukesh is a pawn up, but David has a lead in development. Also, his rook is coming to e8 and can put pressure here. Exactly, that's what he's done. He's played his rook to e8, a check can follow, and Gukesh blocks the check with his bishop. So what is Black's compensation? His compensation does revolve around this d4 pawn. If he can attack it this way, and he does play g6, so that's what he wants to do. He wants to put his bishop on the long diagonal here. d3, nice move by Gukesh, but the knight will come from d6 to f5, and the knight goes back. He is coming to f5 next, and d5, a pawn push has occurred here, and now David goes knight f5. He wants to come knight d4, and you can't play bishop e3 because the knight will take it. But Gukesh finds this beautiful move, king f1. And you will see that Gukesh actually realizes that he doesn't need to connect his rooks, because this rook can get activated this way, while with h4 the rook can get activated from the other way. So that is what he wants to do. And now rook b1 h5 played by David. He's gaining space, and Gukesh can actually fight for space there with h4. No, he goes bishop d2, and maybe David can take more space with h4, stopping the rook coming out from h1. No, he goes rook e7. He wants to double here, but now Gukesh plays a great move, h4. So you will see that this rook can come out from h3. The bishops are in the center, the rook is on the other end. Rook e8 played, and now the bishop will simply drop back to d1. Wow, great coordination. And if you play bishop h6 now, I can go bishop b4 and hit your rook, not take the bishop, because then there is a back rank mate threatened here. So bishop b4 is the idea. But c5 played by David. He wants to stop the bishop from coming to b4. So bishop h6 now becomes a real idea. Well, Gukesh can actually take en passant and then open up the position with g4. That would be a very, very nice way to play, because then his bishops do get breathing space. But here he goes directly g4, which is also a fine move. So Gukesh has in some ways stabilized his position and also kept his extra pawn. And one would not think that his pieces are developed, but they are. That's modern day chess. You don't need to develop them in the traditional way with connection of the rooks and so on. Bishop h6 played. Now if you take here, then after knight h6, the rooks are very well placed, and clearly you don't want to let this happen. So Gukesh plays his bishop to c3. He moves his bishop here. Maybe later the bishop can move to f6. And David Navara plays his knight to d4. And he's telling Gukesh that, look, if you take here, then maybe it's the opposite colored bishops. Gukesh says, I have no intention of giving my bishop for your knight. And he plays his pawn to b4. Pawn moves up to f5. Well, the bishop always has found good home on the d1 square, and he does so again. He puts his bishop back on d1. This is a very powerful bishop that can move in both directions, bishop a4, bishop h5. You know, Gukesh just recently has played this freestyle chess at Weissenhaus, and I feel this game is such a good representation of such chess. Bishop takes e2 played on the board, and now the rook is planning to come on e2, and this rook on b1 can open up. Next move, exactly, bishop b takes c5, and this is very serious edge for Gukesh. You will see that now he not only has an extra pawn, but his rook stands on a beautiful file here. His other rook can come to g1 and attack the g6 pawn, and this looks really, really good. And here the way in which white plays, yes, rook to b5, good move there, because he wants to attack here, maybe force exactly bishop f8, and then he can come back to b2 and trade off one of the active rooks. Yes, exactly, Gukesh doing this really well, and he's on course for the full point. What a nice game played by him until now. The game has been complex. David has been finding some good moves, but Gukesh has been up to the task, takes bishop b2. Now the rook has no entry points on the e file, so David goes king c7, smart move. He wants to get the rook from b8. So rook g1 played. Gukesh says, I want to attack here. Maybe a better way to begin was bishop c3, because if rook b8, you can go king e2 and get your rook here. But he goes rook g1, and now David Navara can actually play rook b8 and attack the bishop. Now very important for Gukesh to put his bishop on f6, because then after a check and the rooks being traded, the bishop defends the pawn. There's no way to attack it with bishop e7, but he goes bishop c3, and this is a dubious decision, because now after a check, and if you trade the rooks, let's imagine that I give a check here, which is what David does, and if you go king g2, then after takes, bishop e7, and this pawn is falling, but David goes Gukesh goes bishop e1 and keeps the pieces on the board and says, next move I'm going to take here on g6. You can also not play here because of bishop a5. So David Navara has to tread carefully here, and he finds the best move, bishop g7. Now taking this pawn would be incorrect, because then there's this pin. So clearly Gukesh has to move his king to g2. Suddenly the attack on the g6 pawn is gone, and you can literally sense that David's position is getting better. Now nice trick there, bishop a5 check and winning the rook. So the king moves to the side, David being very alert, and all of a sudden it's black who's putting pressure here. So Gukesh says, let me trade off the rooks. That seems like the best thing to do, but now his chances of winning have gone away, have withered away, and in fact now David can take the rook. It's a good decision. King takes, and you can attack this pawn already, but even more accurate way to do is to go bishop b2, provoke the pawn to come forward, which is what David does, and once it comes forward, later on the king can easily get and attack this pawn here. So a4 played, and now bishop comes back to f6, attacking the h4 pawn. So fantastic chess here by David Navara, showing great endgame skills. And for Gukesh, it's very, very tough now, because he was completely better, close to winning, but from there he's landed up in an equal endgame, and David is doing this very carefully and nicely. King comes up to b6, and Gukesh goes king g2. Now he's going to lose this pawn. I believe David will snatch that pawn up. Bishop takes h4, and yes, he's played it. Bishop takes pawn, and for Gukesh, where is his play? He goes d4, but this is again a scary move, because now after pawn takes, bishop takes, which is what is likely to happen. There's a check, but the king can jump here and now start to attack these pawns here on c4, d5. So Gukesh has to remain a bit careful, but I think he's got things under control. The logical result of this game should be a draw. So bishop takes, pawn takes d4, and now bishop takes d4 check. King has to come to a5. You can also play king e6, but slightly passive. So king goes to a5, attacking the a4 pawn. And if you take on a7, which could be possible, then I take on a4, and position looks quite fine for both sides. But Gukesh now, he's still thinking about, is there a way where I can actually win this position? That's how Gukesh thinks always. He's very, very ambitious. He pushes his pawn to c5, and somewhere he is looking at ideas where he can push his pawn to c6. Bishop e7 played by David. If you take this pawn on a4, then c6 already is a winning move, because now the pawn is moving ahead here, like let's say bishop d8, bishop e5 and c7. So first David goes here bishop e7, Gukesh pushes his pawn. A good way to draw here was c6, because after take, let's say bishop d6, you can take on a7 and this game would end in a draw. But instead Gukesh again goes d6, keeping the juice in the game, trying that if there's any way for him to win. But remember, he's also now 15 minutes on the clock, so he needs to take care of the time, because these endgames can get notoriously complicated, to find the win. So bishop d8 played, and now there's this interesting move that Gukesh has, and he has to play it, otherwise he will be in trouble. King takes a4 and king coming back would give black the win. So c6, the best move, has been found by Gukesh, and now David must take the pawn, which he does. D takes c6 and Gukesh snatches the pawn on a7. There's one way that white can actually now think about winning. There's this move, bishop b8 to c7 and then d7 d8. So David now takes on a4, but what does he have in mind for bishop b8, bishop c7? Exactly, Gukesh plays it. Well, there are two ways to meet it, I believe. One is bishop f6 to c5. Let's say here, if you play bishop c7, I go bishop e5, pin it here. The other way, which David finds, is bishop b6. Very nice move. The position is still a draw. After bishop c7, king b5 was the idea, but Gukesh blunders now with king f3. King g3 was still a draw. This is very important because you keep the f pawn open in cases required. But with king f3, now this move g5 is what David has to find. Very tough move, because if you go king b5, then king f4 and the king comes in and takes the pawns. But if David is alert and is playing on both sides of the board, he will be able to, he finds it. Such an important move, and with this Gukesh is suddenly completely lost, because now black has king b5, c5, king c6, king coming and stopping these pawns, and these are powerful pawns. So d7 played by Gukesh, but this pawn is going nowhere. The bishop is controlling it. So time for the king to go back here. King b5 would be a good move. A move like c5 would be a mistake because of bishop a7, and then you take it. So first king b5, that's the right decision. And next up we have c5 and king c6 coming in. And so now Gukesh does not have a move. Look at Gukesh there. He's so upset. He's just completely missed the bus there, and you hardly ever see Gukesh emoting so much on the board, because from a completely winning position and then a completely fine position, he has now landed in a completely lost one. This is the tragedy of a top player. You fight for hours and hours and then you land up. You are often over ambitious as well. Now bishop f6 is the idea, and only move for David to keep the win is bishop d8, but you can bank on him to find it. Of course he does. Bishop d8, what a nice move. And now Gukesh starts moving quickly, but that's not going to be enough, because king c4, king d5, or king c5, king d5 is coming in, and David is doing this very, very carefully. So king c5 first, and now Gukesh goes king d3, but now king d5, again an important move, attacking the bishop, threatening king e6, and king takes pawn. That's the idea. And so bishop goes back to c3, the king will go back now to e6, and the d7 pawn is hanging. So pawn moves up to f3, but now king takes on d7. That's what is played, and bishop d2. Yes, this is now clear that black is 2 pawns up and Gukesh can safely resign. But sometimes out of inertia, you keep making certain moves. King c4, maybe trying to get in with the king here, but the bishop can simply block it. That's exactly what David does. And Gukesh goes king d4. Pawn comes up to c5, because now what essentially is going to happen is that black is going to play g4 at the right time. First king e5, so that now if g4 f4, there is king e4, and Gukesh goes bishop e3, but g4 is a very nice move, because then after take, yes, you cannot take the pawn on c5, because then after I capture the bishop, the g pawn simply runs through. So pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and king d3. David is just going to play king d5 with c4 coming in. These two pawns are too far apart. Gukesh thinks for a bit and resigns the game. David gets up and accepts the resignation. What a win for David.